Dear friends, and welcome to this today's Torah talk on Pirkei Avot. And I'm continuing really according to sequence. This is chapter 1, Mishnah 3, Antigonos ish Socho. Now, Antigonos ish Socho. So let's first read it. You can see right away it's a Greek name, very unusual. Antigonos is the name of a Greek king. And there are other scholars who have Greek names that we know of. There's Rabbi Alexandrai, who's mentioned in Pirkei Avot. And Alexandrai, of course, Alexander, which became actually a very popular name both among Jews and among non-Jews in history. Antigonos is Socho, the man from Socho. He received from Shimon HaTzadik. And Shimon HaTzadik, who we talked about last week. So this is somebody who, it's interesting, he's a student, and he is receiving from Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was the end, supposedly, of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which is really the end of a period. So we are moving now from the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which is the men of the Great Assembly from the first, I would say, half of the Second Temple period, at least the first 200 years of the Second Temple period, in now to the Greek period, which is after of course, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah was under the Persian period, starting with Cyrus, who allowed the Jews to come back to Israel, and then ending, of course, with the Greek conquest of this area, 332 before the Common Era under Alexander the Great, and then later on the Seleucid governments, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids that took over this area. So Antigonos received from Shimon HaTzadik. Hu Omer, he used to say, Al tiu kavadim amshamshim et harav al menat lekabel pras. Do not be like those servants who serve the master in order to receive a reward. Ela havu kavadim, but be like the servants who serve the master not in order to receive a reward. And may the reverence and the fear of heaven be upon you. Now, there's a lot to really say about this Mishnah. Again, we can ask the same question that we asked about Shimon HaTzadik. What does it mean he used to say? Now, one way of understanding he used to say is that this was a motto that represented him. Another idea could be, especially when we talked about Shimon HaTzadik, who supposedly represents the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah by being one of the last of them, could be that this is something which represents also that period in Jewish history. Because we don't have a lot of documents about the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. We don't have a lot of sources about them. There seems to be a bit of lacuna historically in the Second Temple period. From the Greek period on, we have lots of details and lots of information, and very little in the first half. So as we move into the Greek period, there's a certain transformation going on. I also call it the transformation from the movement from prophecy, because the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah had either 3 or 30 prophets, according to the Bavli or the Yerushalmi, and there are none now. Of course, it's all scholars. So the Torah moves from being intuitive and revealed to being wisdom and intellect. Now, this story of Antigonos ish Socho and his statement here, I'm going to argue it's more than just a saying that he used to say in his lifetime. I think it represents something which is going on historically in this time period. Now, I'm going to read to you Rashi. Okay, this one is not Rashi for some reason, so I will read to you the Bartanura. I thought I had the Rashi here. Yes, I do. Sorry about that. So first, Rashi's comment on this Mishnah. Rashi, the famous Bible and Talmudic commentator from 11th century France. Hu haya omer. So Rashi says, this is what he used to say, margela b'flume. Then he brings, of course, a statement. He says, Shamati, I heard, that Tzadok and Baitos were students of Antigonos, and he taught them this idea not to be servants of God in order to receive a reward, but to be servants of the master and not to receive reward. And he did not explain to them what he meant. And therefore they left and they taught other students. And after a time, they actually were convinced that there is no reward in the world to come, and that there is no resurrection of the dead or anything that would be reward in the afterlife. V'yatzu minut, and this brought them to heresy. And these are the students, and their students were called the Sadducees and the Bethusians, or the Baitosim, based on their name. So, this is very interesting. Rashi, even though he says Shamati, I heard, he's actually quoting Avot de Rabbi Natan. Avot de Rabbi Natan is sort of like a commentary, and very early commentary on Pirkei Avot, which according to most scholars is actually written in the, I would say, the Talmudic period, the time of the Amoraim. But it's the style is a Tanaic style. So it seems almost like a midrash, if you might say, on Pirkei Avot, discussing Pirkei Avot, and it's the first one to mention this, that Antigonos had two students, Tzadok and Baitos, who from them came the Sadducees and the Bethusians. This claim is an interesting claim. We have to take it, first of all, to understand why this claim is happening, because more or less at this point in time, which is in the 3rd century before the Common Era, do you have the beginning of the Sadducees as a sect within the Jewish people, which again is something which we have very little source about, and we have to try to understand the sources that are at hand. It's not really clear whether the Sadducees, which I'll mention in a moment, actually started from a student of Antigonos, as is mentioned by Rashi and earlier by the Avot Rabbi Natan. In fact, others actually postulate or hypothesize that it actually might be the Tzadok or descendants of Tzadok the high priest during the time of David and Solomon. And there's actually a lot of reason to think this, because if we take we take the book of Ezekiel, Yechezkel. In Yechezkel, chapter 44, verse 15. But the priests and the Levites, the children of Tzadok, that kept the charge of my sanctuary when the children of Israel went astray from me, they shall come near to me and minister to me, God says through Ezekiel. And they shall stand before me to offer me the fat and the blood, says God. They shall enter into my sanctuary. They shall come near to my table to minister to me, and they shall keep my charge. In other words, the prophet Ezekiel is patting, in the name of God, is praising the family of Tzadok as being the only loyal priests at the time in the early second, this is during the exile, but that Ezekiel's talking. But eventually the descendants of these families obviously see themselves as the only legitimate Kohanim because Ezekiel the prophet said so. And it's very possible that the Sadducees, who become a sect in the Second Temple period, a priestly sect in the temple in Jerusalem, are actually descendants from this family of Tzadok, who were praised a few generations, a few centuries really before them, by Ezekiel. And remember, the priests were very into genealogy and were very, I would say, scrupulous about family genealogy. So it's very possible that we had actual descendants of this Tzadok family mentioned in Ezekiel. And you know what happens at the beginning when it goes to your head, sometimes you feel a little bit infallible and as if you are the ones who are really controlling the future of Judaism. I want to read to you one of the sources about the Sadducees and the Pharisees in the Second Temple period to put things into a little bit of context. We have two sources for them which are well known, both written by Josephus Flavius in the first century. One in his book, the Milchamot Yudim, the Wars of the Jews, where he talks about actually four different sects. But in his Flavius's Antiquities, chapter 18, he talks about three sects of Jews who lived in the Second Temple period, which are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. I'll mention, of course, the Pharisees, which we are descended from, most Jews today, and the Essenes. So he says the Jews had, for a while, three sects of philosophy, he calls it, peculiar to them: the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the third one was the Pharisees, of which sects I have already spoken in the second book of the Jewish War, but I will touch upon it now. The Pharisees, they live meanly and despise the delicacies of diet. They follow the conduct of reason, and what that prescribes to them is good. That's what they do. And they think that they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They pay respect to such that are in their years, meaning to the elderly, and they're not so bold as to contradict them. And when they determine all these things, when they determine that all things are done by fate, they do not take away the freedom of man of acting as he shall think. This sounds like, of course, what Rabbi Akiva is going to say in Pirkei Avot later on, Hakol tzafui v'reshut nutuna, that all is in the hands of heaven, but meaning God sees everything in advance, but it doesn't mean that there's no free will. So he's actually saying it in a different way here, where he's saying that they believe that things are determined by fate, but this does not take away the freedom of man of acting as they think fit. Since this notion is that it pleases God to have a temperament whereby his will is done, so that the will of man can act virtuously or viciously. They also believe that the souls have an immortal rigor, and that there will be reward and punishment. Now, I'll talk about what he says about the Sadducees. The Sadducees believe that the soul dies with the body. They do not regard the observation of anything besides the law, for they think that it's an instance of virtue to dispute with teachers of philosophy whom they frequent. But this doctrine was received by a few, yet by those still of the greatest dignity, because they were high priests. But they are able to do almost nothing for themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not bear them. So Josephus is also telling us something socially about this time. The people were behind the Pharisees, but the Sadducees were the sort of snooty, nose in the air, you might say upper class, who were living in Jerusalem, and they did not believe in the afterlife and the eternity of the soul, and they also did not regard of anything except for the actual law, meaning what the rabbi said, as I said before, the oral tradition, they didn't take so seriously. He actually goes into greater detail about this in the Wars of the Jews, and he actually sort of describes them in this, I would say, very snobbish fashion, and again implies that the people were behind the Pharisees. Now, this snobism could be what I speculated before, that they were descendants of Tzadok, who, according to the book of Ezekiel, was the Kohen family to follow God. It is possible, but of course, as Josephus said, they were realists. They had to live with the Pharisees, and therefore they coexisted, even if they had differences of opinion. Having said this, let's go back now to Pirkei Avot and try to understand again what it says. I'm taking another commentary now. Antigonos ish socho. What does he say? He received from Shimon Tzadik, but also he has two students according to this tradition of Tzadok and Baitos. Again, it's a question of exactly how the Sadducees started. I don't want to go into the historical question, but they de facto existed. And they did not believe in the mortality of the soul, and they had problems with the oral tradition in general. So, to understand it in this light, now listen again to what Antigonus says. Now, Antigonus, as a Pharisee, of course, he believes in the immortality of the soul. And obviously, the immortality of the soul is actually not mentioned specifically in the 24 books of our Bible, in the Masoretic text. So it's easy to understand how somebody would think that maybe Judaism doesn't believe in the immortality of the soul. In fact, in the early 18th century, well, actually, it's the late 18th century, excuse me, it's not unusual then to know that Immanuel Kant in Germany was very puzzled because he thought that Judaism didn't believe in the afterlife because the Old Testament, meaning our Torah, doesn't talk about it. And he was puzzled how you can have a religion which does not believe in the summum bonum, in some type of greater good that happens after life. So he was not, of course, familiar with the Talmud. In the Tractate of Sanhedrin, which says, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek olam haba, all of Israel have a place of the world to come. So this argument is going around already in the time of Antigonus between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, it's known that really in the 24 books of the Bible, it's not mentioned that there is an afterlife. There are some places which seem to hint at the concept of an afterlife, or let's say a resurrection of the dead, but then again, you have to explain what that would mean. For instance, if I take chapter 3 in Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, everything goes to the same place. Everything started from the earth and goes back to the earth. But who knows the spirit of man which goes upward, and the spirit of the animals which goes downward into the land? And then, of course, in another place also, Kohelet says, Veharuach, that the body goes down to the dust, and the spirit goes up to God who gave it. So these two implications seem to imply that there is some type of immortality of the soul, but it seems to be just a hint. For the idea of the resurrection of the dead, which also the Sadducees did not believe in, there's a hint in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. So Daniel and his, well, we don't consider him a prophet, but he does speak in Ruach HaKodesh, which means through the divine inspiration. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and they who turn away to righteousness, like the stars, meaning turn towards righteousness, like the stars, will shine forever and ever. So Antigonus realizes that he is dealing now with the necessity to deal with the issues between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I already mentioned that the whole first chapter of Pirkei Avot, dealing with the oral transmission of the oral Torah, is really trying to use this as an au contraire, as opposition to the thinking of the Sadducees. And the same with this Mishnah. So just think for a moment. Antigonus believes in the world to come. And therefore, the first question is, if there's a world to come, that means that you're telling everybody to keep the mitzvot for a reward. Isn't that taking away something from the mitzvot? Rabbi Kook, Abraham Isaac Kook, in his book Orot HaTorah, when he tries to address the question of why the world to come is not mentioned in the Torah, in the 5 books, in the 25 books of the Moses, 24 books of the Bible, at least not directly, he says, let's think for a second. If the Torah would have said there's a world to come, it's like you're really dwarfing and diminishing the significance of the mitzvot. Because it sounds like you're telling me to do a mitzvah, then you're telling me there's a reward. So I'm doing the mitzvah as a means to an end. That means it's not the mitzvah that's important, it's the end, getting the reward, the pie in the world to come. That's what it's all about. Tell me to stand on my head, I'll do the same. So basically, Rav Kook says if the Torah were to talk about the world to come, it would be like shooting itself in the foot. Because the whole point is schar mitzvah mitzvah, that the word of commandment is its own command. That's the mindset we have to have. And if our mindset is going to be that we're keeping the mitzvot for a place in the world to come, we're diminishing the significance and the value of the mitzvah itself. So, which would be, of course, a conflict of interest. So this is why Antigonus is saying, do not be like the servant who serves his master for reward. There is a world to come, but that's not the right mindset. The mindset should be, as it says later, schar mitzvah mitzvah. The reward of the command is its command. And schar avira avira. And the punishment for the bad deed is the fact that you did a bad deed. And the fact that you are leading yourself and society astray. That's how people should see it. It doesn't mean there's no place in the world to come. There is, but that's not your mindset. You should be like avadim, like servants who serve the master not to receive a reward and have the fear of heaven upon you. So what we have here then is a polemic, not just a neutral statement. If at this time of Antigonus we have the roots and the beginnings of this rift between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So Antigonus, who's representing the Pharisees, is saying, I understand your problem with the world to come, but I'm telling my people to keep the mitzvot for their own sake. The fact that we also believe in the world to come is not there to diminish the meaning of the mitzvot. The mitzvot are here to rectify this world. But it doesn't mean there's not a place for the world to come. We just don't talk about it a lot, and we don't know that much about it. Another thing which is pointed out, by the way, by the Maharal of Prague, he says you have two things here. When you do something not for reward, you're doing it out of love. But worshiping God out of love is not enough. And that's why he finishes off by saying, Vihi mora shamayim alechem. You also have to have the fear of God upon you. Why is it not enough? This is discussed by Rabbi Kook in his famous book, Musar Avicha, The Ethics of the Fathers. And he says, even though Rambam points out and others points out that the goal is to worship God out of love, out of understanding, and out of personal conviction, and not out of fear. That's definitely the higher level. But every individual also needs the fear of heaven because we're not always at our ultimate level. We're not always at our optimal level. And things come around, self-interest or whatever, and sometimes you want to bend the rules. That's where we need the fear of God sometimes, to remind us, get back to it. I've always said for a person to break the law, you need three things. Because there are three things that prevent a person from going astray on the wrong road. One of them is our convictions, our beliefs. Let's say four things. One is our convictions, our beliefs. If we break our convictions, our belief, we have a guilty conscience. Our conscience is number two. Number three is the law. There could be a law out there which also says to us what we shouldn't do. We don't want to break the law. And number four is the police force. Okay, so this is not just about Torah I'm talking about, in general. So there is our convictions, but we can sometimes break our convictions and we have a guilty conscience which will tell us, well, maybe we shouldn't have. There is, of course, the law of the land. We also don't want to break the law of the land, and there's a police force to enforce the law of the land. So we have little barriers that help us. In the same way, in relationship to God, we have to have both the conviction, which is worshiping out of love, and also the fear, which there is a lot more to say about this, the level of fear and love. In fact, in the writings of the Maharal of Prague, he's going to claim that when we're talking about the zugot, the partners, that from the next Mishnah on, that each one was a president and of the Sanhedrin and the head of the Beit Din of the Sanhedrin, he's going to say the reason why you have two in each one is talking about worship of God according to love, and one is going to be talking about worship of God out of fear. and it's going to be two perspectives each time. So then next week, when we talk about Pirkei Avot as an introduction, I'm going to talk about what does it mean, the relationship of love and fear to God, and how was it seen in both philosophic and Kabbalistic writings. Shalom, shalom.